We invited the co-chairs of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration to come in here today and tell us about the findings and recommendations of their report. Having them here to tell us in person really makes a difference. There's some good news. One really good piece of news is there's a new baby in the world. The not so good news is Ben Ginsberg is with that new baby somewhere instead of here. So one of the co-chairs isn't with us today, but as you've learned already from my previous introductions, every change gives us an opportunity. And this one is that with this presentation now, we can not only have a co-chair, but also a commissioner who was on the Presidential Commission. They'll be up here together. The commissioner is Tammy Patrick, who you heard from earlier, the federal compliance officer from Maricopa County, Arizona. And she will join Mr. Bob Bauer together up here to tell you about the highlights, what's good, what's not so good, a little more of that. All right, I'm pleased to introduce the two to come in here and tell us the nitty-gritty about this report. Thank you.
Does this work? Yes, it does. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be with the foundation, with which we had early discussions in this process, and also delighted here to be with Commissioner Tammy Patrick, who was a mainstay of the commission, one of our truly outstanding commissioners, and also displayed under conditions of stress unfailingly good cheer, which nobody could ever accuse me of doing. In any event, thank you for having us. I know that Tammy had the opportunity to talk briefly about some of the recommendations that were specifically directed toward military and overseas voters, and I won't repeat what she said here. Let me talk a little bit about overall, and I want to invite Tammy to join me and give her perspective as well, and we're happy to take questions, and maybe we'll leave the better part of the time for questions. But what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about how we saw our mission, some of which I think you may be familiar with, but there's some points I would like to emphasize, and then beyond that, what happens now? Because the what happens now question is a very important question for this commission. From the very beginning, we did not want to simply write a report. As you know, Washington is a prodigious location for the production of reports. Somebody could also say it is a location where reports go to die. And we wanted to write a report that was informed as well as we could possibly have it be informed by the very best data, the very best social science, the very best testimony, and the living experience of people who are involved with elections, those who administer them at the state and local level, and those who have spent a good bit of time thinking about how to make our electoral process more responsive to the voters. And as you know from the report, if you've had a chance to look at it, we met election officials across the country, and we were really impressed. Democrats, Republicans, whatever ideological stripe they may or may not have been wearing, were genuinely dedicated to the business of working, often with very limited resources, to make the elections process as good as it can be and to address the weaknesses in the process and to address them effectively and make the system stronger. They deserve, and the voters in particular deserve, more obviously than a generalized set of recommendations that collect dust on the shelf. So our goal was to write a report that was crisp, concise, concrete, hard-headed, practical, informed by this living experience with elections, and that once written could be the basis for an ongoing discussion and ongoing activity in the states and in the localities about ways to implement the recommendations for the benefit of voters. What we discovered, my co-chair Ben Ginsberg is not here today. As you know, he's in California. He teaches there this semester, and he is also a brand new grandfather, and so he is there with his new grandson, Zach. And Ben is as Republican as I am Democrat. But we discovered that, and I think we knew this going in, that if you stay completely focused on election administration as public administration, not as it's often discussed, which is as a source of partisan conflict and controversy, but as public administration, and if you stay completely focused on the interests of voters, what voters need, who voters are, the respect we owe the voters, there is a path through and between and around some of the key partisan conflicts and an opportunity to talk about genuine improvements that could affect the voting experience, improve the voting experience for millions of voters. Our recommendations, we believe, are practical. Some of them may require additional resources that election administrators have not been given. Some of them may not, and some of them would not, in fact. And yet, even where resources are required, and in all other respects, in support of all the other recommendations we make and best practices that we outline, we're prepared to be helpful. We are prepared to fan out as a commission and in every way possible support administrators in the efforts to make these recommendations come to life and be meaningful in the activities of, in the lives of voters and in the experience of voters. One of the questions that we get was, what did we choose to include and what did we not include? We actually addressed each and every one of the issues, as indeed we had to, that was specified to us in the executive order that the President issued that established the Election Commission. There are obviously some issues of contemporary controversy and voting rights that we didn't address, issues that are in active litigation or that are the stuff of federal legislative endeavor. That was not our charge. But again, we're quite confident that those issues in their own fora await resolution. The recommendations that we made on online voting registration and locating appropriate polling places and addressing the crisis in voting technology and improving services and outreach to overseas and military voters, the online tools that we made available for lines and the recommendations we made for managing resources at the polling place effectively, the recommendation we made in support of multiple opportunities to vote before Election Day through mail and early voting and the like, that in the aggregate, that would have a dramatic effect on the experience of voters, and it would really reach a significant number of voters in jurisdictions which would like very much to improve the voting experience that they're delivering to their citizens. So I think that's roughly speaking the sort of the message that I'm carrying. In the months ahead, I, Ben, Tammy, the other commissioners are going to put in as much time as necessary. And I know the President indicated to us when we met with the President and the Vice President to submit to the report that anything the administration can do, it will do to support this. We've received a very positive response on Capitol Hill as well, so we understand from members of Congress who've been interested in this issue that they also will support what we're trying to do. We've heard professional organizations, they'll support it. Many of the academic and other experts in this field who have read the report have responded well to it and offered their continued assistance in explaining the data and the analysis that underline some of these recommendations. And so in a word, or in a phrase, I'll repeat what our senior research director, Nate Persley, professor at Stanford, said time and again, which is this is not a report, it's a project, and we treat it as a project. The report initiates the project. The project is underway now. Those are some preliminary comments. I'd like Tammy to join with any thoughts she has on the overall structure and how we went about the task, and then we can answer your questions.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I shared with you some of those thoughts earlier this morning. But in relationship to what happens here in the country, as opposed to our discussion on military and overseas voters, one of the things that we did recommend is that the goal for election administrators should be that voters should not have to wait more than half an hour in order to cast their ballot. But we didn't just set that bar and then say, go forth and try and make it so, because many of my election administrative colleagues thought, oh my word, now this is what I'm going to be held to, what if I can't do it? Instead, we said this is our goal with the understanding that sometimes when you get to the polling place on election morning, there are 200 people standing in line, and they've been standing in line for an hour before the polls even open. Are they all going to be processed in half an hour? Probably not. So it's more of a goal, but to understand that the allocation of resources can be done well in advance. So the Commission has out on our website, which will eventually be housed at the Caltech MIT location, some resource allocation tools developed by a number of different organizations and groups that shared them with us to share with the voting population, with administrators, oversight groups, advocacy groups, and voters themselves, where you can go out and you can plug in about how many people are registered in a voting precinct, approximately how long it takes to check in a voter, how long does it take to vote that ballot, and you can use these tools to see how many machines do I need to allocate, how many people should I hire to work at the polling place, so that hopefully we can help to reach those goals. One of the comments that I made last week when we were actually meeting at the White House was that as an administrator, as a local administrator, we always want to give our poll workers the tools to make them successful. And I really look at this report as hopefully providing some guidance and in some cases a heavy stick or a carrot, depending on your situation in your jurisdiction or your state, to administrators to say, look, I've been saying for years that we should look into getting e-poll books because it's going to streamline our process. We can keep our voter rolls more current. I don't have to print up a book 2 months before the election and then have these addendums that maybe our poll workers aren't looking at and voters are being sent to the provisional table. So there's a lot in the report. It's been out there for about a week, so some of you have had the opportunity to read it at least online, and we do have some copies here. But I think that we would prefer to just open it up and answer questions that you have in regards to the report and any of the findings that we have.
Including, if you want us to elaborate on any of the key recommendations. Of course, divided into between key recommendations, because we wanted to keep some focus on high impact change and reform. And then best practices, some of which are highlighted in the report that we picked out as being particularly relevant to the charge, but others, many of them very, very good, that are contained in an appendix which you'll find online that is, I think, at least 1,000 pages in length, but organized so you don't have to get lost in cyberspace. You can see it by topic, and you can, I think, relatively quickly go to what you're looking for.
And many of the recommendations and best practices are very practical. It's common sense. So one of the things we suggest is that if lines form, that you have your poll workers trained to have someone that walks up and down the line to try and make sure that the people who are at least standing in line are standing in the right line. There are a lot of things like that that are very implementable. They don't take legislation. They don't necessarily take additional resources. Sometimes it's just adding an additional responsibility to someone who's already being hired to work at the polls.
Yeah, and by the way, we've invited questions in now. I don't mean to head you off here, but two other things I thought of. Among those that there are a number of things that might involve state legislative activity, one of which, of course, will be resources as required for some of what we're talking about. In some cases, by the way, the resources that are invested are going to be well repaid by savings. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about online registration, and frankly, over time, online registration more than makes back what you have to put into it to set it up in the first place. So there's no fiscal stress associated with it, quite the contrary. The other is this whole debate over polling locations, and the use of schools as polling locations. That is a key recommendation. We added that. One of the biggest problems we have in this country, it feeds into lines, it feeds into other problems as well, is that administrators in some jurisdictions, and far too many at that, have difficulty finding suitable places to hold polling, to hold voting. They don't have facilities that are adequate to the task. We heard one story told about a polling location that was sort of being frantically searched after, and ultimately the facility that was used was parked sort of basically on the border of the desert with a corrugated tin roof in which the temperatures reach 103 degrees in the sun. But there was not a huge amount of willingness in the community to make other facilities available. The best facilities are schools from the standpoint of ADA compliance and space and connectivity. And the problem, of course, is that some schools have become skittish and school boards have become skittish. Some localities, some legislators have become skittish, understandably so, about schools and the security problems that have been presented for having any kind of non-school activities on campus while students are present. And one of the recommendations we make is that schooling locations not only be used, but that the security issue be addressed by scheduling what all schools have in service professional days when teachers are present for meetings and training, but students are not, and schedule election day for those days so that there isn't a security concern about the students, but the schools are still open and the calendar of the school isn't fundamentally changed. It's just rearranged to suit the occasion of voting. The two comments about state legislature, that could engage the state legislatures in a discussion because some state legislatures have been active on this whole question of what they'll permit and not permit in the way of school availability for polling places. The last comment I wanted to make was because Tammy talked about lines. Lines are obviously very much associated with the establishment of the commission. So although we talk about a variety of stresses on the electoral system and how we might want to address them, a number of them feed into the lines problems. Others are not obviously directly, they don't bear directly in sort of origin or impact on lines, but they do have to do with the voters' general experience. But I do want to kick off the question by telling you one of the more, because Tammy mentioned the line walkers, and I mentioned earlier election administration as public administration. One of our commissioners was, he's not any longer, he went on to another senior corporate position, but at the time he was in charge of Disney's theme parks. And so, as you can imagine, we asked him, because Disney spends a lot of time thinking about moving large numbers of people through lines and otherwise through locations. We asked whether we could meet with Disney's industrial engineering staff and administrative personnel to talk to them about how they think through the design of locations to facilitate the efficient movement of large numbers of people who are being provided a service. And that's how we think about these voters, that we're providing them a service. This is a day in the lives of our citizens in which they ought to feel that they're the center of attention because they're the boss. They're the boss on that day, and that's something that they ought to keenly feel, even if they run into a problem. How that problem is solved reflects directly on the respect that we show voters. So the commission went to Disney World. We went to Disney World in advance of winning the game. We hadn't won the game yet. We left for Disney World. And I want you to know, it was all business. We went into the control rooms. We watched from the interior of Disney, and in the briefings that we received, including the one that kicked off for 2 hours before the day began, we spent a lot of time with their industrial engineering staff. And the point I guess I want to stress here is, speaking again of election administration and public administration, is that a company like Disney, and there are other examples that we heard of other commercial concerns that think constantly about the delivery of services, are continuously thinking about ways that they can solve problems. Tammy mentioned sort of the person who goes up and down the line, tries to find a problem. They also have at Disney something called, the actual expression escapes me now, the exceptions line.
The fast pass?
Well, it's the one where you pull somebody out of the line.
Pass. They've changed names a couple of times.
A couple of times, but the long and short of it is, the long and short of it is, if you're in the line and something goes wrong, right? Your name isn't on the registration rolls. Or at Disney, you have the electronic pass, and it doesn't actually trigger access into the park. The turnstile, which by the way never turns red. If you try to get through the turnstile, some of you may know, it turns blue, and that indicates that you have if it's green if you can go through. It's blue if you can't, because red's sort of a negative color, and there's one thing you don't have is a negative experience at Disney. So the long and short of it is you're either in green or you're not blue. But if it's blue, they move the individual who's running into the problem out of that line and into an exceptions line to avoid backing up the people behind that individual, but also to have the person who's running into the problem immediately sense that he or she is being treated appropriately, right? Not yelled at, not scorned, eyebrow not raised at their failure perhaps to have quite understood the day they were supposed to show up. They just get their problem solved, but it gets solved in a way that maximizes the convenience for everybody, both the person who ran into the problem and the people behind that person. So we had, and one of our more interesting meetings was a stand-up discussion that we had very earnestly in the middle of Dumbo's Flying Circus. And last but not least, one of the more entertaining comments, quips that was made while we were on this commission, our commissioner from the theme park world, who was listening to us talk about different ways to move people through a polling place, said, well, I realize it's not practical. He said, but everything changes if on the other side of the experience that they're having, there's a gift shop. So in any event, we don't put the gift shop into the recommendations, but
we do hand out an I voted sticker, don't we?
Yeah,
So
we do
serves
hand
almost the same purpose.
an I voted sticker. So anyway, with that, we'd be glad to answer any questions that you have.
So I'm Douglas Jones, a sometime member of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee of the EAC, of the sometimes EAC. One of the things that always frustrated me there was that we had so little data about how things actually worked. Mm-hmm. There was always this promise that election incident reports would come to us, but what we saw was very minimal. And the other experience I have is working in election protection on election day. And due to good luck, I've had access to 2 different election protection databases of the 3 great election protection databases that are out there on election day. The Democratic Party runs an election incident reporting system. The Republican Party runs an election incident reporting system. And there's the 1-800-OUR-VOTE election incident reporting system. And in attempting, of course, no one has access to both the Democratic and Republican data. That's highly compartmentalized. But in comparing the 2 databases I saw, there was very little overlap. In fact, I'm not sure I saw any overlap, which suggests to me that when election incidents are reported, they're only reported once to one of those databases, or they may be reported to the county and then they go up through the chain that ends up at the EAC sometimes. And this fragmentation of the data about how our systems are actually performing and the fragmentation of data about the problems actually occurring at the polling places means that nobody gets a complete picture. My pie-in-the-sky desire is to get the Republicans and the Democrats to sanitize their data and merge it and donate it to the public interest to be combined with 1-800-OUR-VOTES to create what I think might be a nearly complete picture of what actually goes wrong in real polling places on election day. I don't know how to make this happen, but I suggested it early on in your commission's process, and I want to bring that up today again because I feel desperate for data about how things actually work.
Well, Doug, in the report, we actually do bring to light the fact that we need to collect more data, both as election administrators as well for a variety of reasons, to know why you're getting an increase in provisional ballots or why you're getting an increase in rejected ballot rates. And all of these things are very, very critical. And when it comes to the sharing of incident reports, I will tell you that I think probably every election administrator would love to know when instances are occurring and being reported to these various locations, because we usually don't hear about it. If we do hear about it, it could be months, maybe years later in a public forum. And then it's always kind of a surprise, and it makes you wonder what was the real issue with that voter? Why did they have that experience? Was it a failing of the voter registration system? Was it a failing of poll workers? Who were the poll workers? What training did they attend? I mean, we need desperately that kind of information. So I think that any organizations that gather that data should really try and establish good relationships with the election administrators and share that information so that we can really find out what the problem was in that instance. A couple of the other recommendations that we have will cut to some of the problems that voters encounter, and that has to do with modernizing our voter registration systems, not only with the online voter registration, but making sure that NVRA is being enforced. I talked this morning a little bit about enforcement of UOCAVA and some of the MOVE Act considerations, but we also talk about compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Voting Rights Act, and HAVA, all of these things that tie into that voter's experience. And improving our registration rules, not just in ensuring that MVRA is working at the Department of Motor Vehicles, which impacts about 90% of our voters and above. And I think Commissioner Thomas would be very upset if I did not put that in, that comment, but also the other assistance agencies, and doing cross-state data checks and matches to both identify voters who are not yet registered and try and get them registered beforehand, which is the ERIC project, as well as identifying voters who are perhaps registered 2 places and in some instances may be voting in 2 places.
And since Ben is not here, couldn't be here today, and I think I generally have his proxy, I'm here to announce he is prepared to give the Republican Party database to the Democratic Party. And we'll decide later whether to reciprocate.
I was waiting earlier with the comment about the red and the blue lights. And
yes, yeah, that's right.
If Ben had been sitting here, there would have been some additional comments going back and forth between the two, I'm sure.
Duncan Buell, University of South Carolina. I'm supervising a capstone group of students doing a mobile app to do waiting lines. And one thing I noticed in the report, we specifically decided not to release the line data to anybody except the election officials until polls closed, because we didn't want to affect the process in process. And I think your report suggests otherwise. And I get a chance to convey this information back from the source.
You mean about why we came out the way we did?
Yeah. Should the line information be released as it happens or not?
I think that our view, and Tammy should comment as well, I think that our view was that voters, again, speaking again about how we treat them, ought to have the opportunity to judge in real time when it is possible for them to move their voting experience forward, when it would be possible for them to cast their ballot in an efficient and time-effective manner. And therefore, having some sense of wait time gives them an opportunity to plan. It's a tool. Obviously, and I totally understand it, there's a contrary point of view, and there are some concerns somebody could legitimately express about that. But it does seem that people have to make decisions, and again, this is going to be affected about whether they have choices to vote before Election Day, by the way, which is one of the reasons why the multiple opportunities to vote before Election Day become so important, because then they can plan a day. I early voted in Maryland. I went one day when the line looked like it was going to be very, very long, and I returned another day, and I voted then. But in a single-day experience, having some understanding of what you're facing, it seems to me, is something that is valuable to voters and suggests to them that you're really thinking about what that experience is going to mean to them.
And we did discuss there's a big distinction between the online dashboards that are showing the wait times at different early voting locations or vote centers where the voters have the opportunity to say, this one has a line that's too long, I can drive 5 miles over and not have a wait if I go to this location. So we had that discussion about how critical that is in those two situations and how it might have an impact on Election Day. But it may also have a positive effect that the voter then brings along a camp chair and a bottle of water because they know they're going to be there rather than getting there, putting themselves in a bad situation where they're maybe less inclined to be able to stay and end up rolling off like some voters unfortunately do when the waits are so incredibly long. But we did definitely have that very discussion.
It has to be quick.
Okay, it's going to be very quick. Dana DeBevois, Travis County, Texas. That's Austin, Texas. So nice to be with y'all again. Quickly, I'd like to hear some advice that where you've heard from all over the United States about the concept of by mail early voting being used, and I do this in a positive sense, being used as a way to counter many of the other problems that we see in voters trying to access an in-person polling place. For example, and using by-mail voting to address other problems. We've heard of it being used as a way to address ID problems, to bypass that. How do you feel about by-mail voting, or did you hear advice as you traveled around about by-mail voting being expanded for the purposes of trying to help voters more quickly navigate the system, as opposed to the other side that, by-mail voting is a little archaic and might even be a little bit more difficult? Could you shed some light on perhaps that conversation? Thank you.
Well, by and large, I mean, look, first of all, you can imagine the testimony about by-mail voting from Washington and Oregon was extremely enthusiastic. It's the only way you can cast a ballot there, so they're very fond of it. I don't know that we heard, there are obviously some issues with every mode of voting. right? I mean, one of the things that we talked about a little bit is some of the issues that are presented for all-mail voting by ballot loss in the mails, and and some of the questions about whether over the long run some of the stresses experienced by the Postal Service are going to continue to present significant issues for mail voting. But the Commission, I think it's fair to say, and I don't think it's certainly anything like this is reflected in the report, did not reflect any negativity, if you will, about mail voting at all. I think it's an opportunity that in some jurisdictions is quite popular. I met yesterday with the Association of Retired Persons, and they're very, very keen on making sure that we preserve and enhance in every way mail voting alternatives for senior citizens. So that would how my immediate response is not, Dana, not negative.
And we get into such detail, I think, in the report. We even recommend, which is what we heard from election administrators, to make sure you have a good rapport with your local postmaster, that you get your ballots returned to a P.O. box, and that you're there at the close, the deadline of when ballots can be returned, so that you're accepting them at the last possible minute. The post office has some mechanisms in place that they'll now know when ballot mailings are coming from jurisdictions. They'll be flagged internally for everything that's done with an intelligent mail barcode. So we do recommend ballot tracking, verifications. So any method in which the ballots are being cast, there has to be security and confidence in the system that only those voters who are eligible are getting those ballots and voting those ballots and returning those ballots to be tabulated.
With that, I think we have a great deal of thanks to both you, Bob, and you, Tammy, for your second appearance. And we really appreciate all the hard work the Commission did. I think it gives us all a lot to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's your mic.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Big data. Big data. No conference on elections would be complete or legitimate without a discussion about big data. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Bob Blaemire. He's going to tell us about that. Bob comes from Catalist, an organization that focuses on voter registration lists. Bob entered the business of the voter registration file world, or whatever he calls it, before there was a voter registration file world. He's part of creating it. He's been in that business for over 30 years, or maybe just around 30. He might dispute me on that. Let's hear from him about what the potential of the data in our voter files really offers. Please welcome Bob Blaemire.
Thank you, Susan. I started when I was a child, just to make sure you know that. Okay, there was a conversation between a doctor, an architect, and a politician about whose profession was the oldest. And the doctor says, well, surely if you look in the Bible, you can see it says that Adam created Eve by extracting one of his ribs. Now, you don't think he would have done that without a surgeon present, do you? And the architect says, that may be, but if you go back further in the Bible, you'll see it says that out of chaos in 7 days, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you don't think he would have done that without an architect present, do you? And the politician says, that may be, but who do you think created the chaos? And for those of you who have had any experience in political campaigns, chaos is a word that is often felt, if not used. And the world that I work in and live in, this world of voter data, it seems to be one of the anti-chaotic aspects of campaigning. It is quantifiable, and it allows us to use voter lists to not only pick out who we're going to communicate with, but to know enough information to be able to communicate relevantly with voters. I often say that the more you know about a voter, the better you can communicate with them. And increasingly, we want to be as precise as possible on knowing who to communicate with, what to say, and these days, how to communicate, what channel, and what new technology do I use to link my message up with that voter. But let me take you first a little bit of a history lesson. That one, okay. Where we go back and think about how the franchise has developed and grown throughout the years. I mean, when it first started, we had white male property owners were basically the people that voted in this country, and gradually that increased to, we got to the years of Andrew Jackson, and you had virtually all adult white males were able to vote. As each state kept being added to the rolls, there would be the continuing argument about whether they should be slave or free, which of course led to our Civil War. And then after the Civil War, we had the 15th Amendment, and racial barriers to voting were dropped, and so therefore all adult males, 18 or 21 and above, were able to vote. Moving on to the 20th century, after World War I, we had the amendment passed to give women the right to vote. And so the franchise virtually doubled overnight. And it was increased again in the 70s with the 26th Amendment to the Constitution when 18-year-old voters were given the right to vote. During the same time in our history, the ways of campaigning changed. I mean, early on, you campaigned through the newspaper or at the public square. We do have evidence that Abraham Lincoln, when he was running for Congress, got voter lists and wrote letters to the voters. But mainly, it was a campaign by surrogate. Presidential campaigns in particular, the presidential candidates did not go out on the stump and campaign. They had the famous front porch campaigns. And it wasn't until Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 that the president actually went out and campaigned for himself. So as campaigning changed and the country grew and those who were eligible to vote grew, the importance of targeting and being able to spend your money wisely grew with it. And at the same time, the campaigns grew increasingly more expensive as our technology changed. As we all know, that once we got into the 50s and the 60s and the advent of television, the expense of campaigns just exploded. And as increasing technology became available and there was the advent of political consultants, campaigns became increasingly expensive, which made it more and more important to be able to target. So we've had all this increase in the franchise, and we've had campaigns getting more expensive, and we still have the one obstacle to voting that existed in most of the country, which is the necessity to register to vote. And because all states but North Dakota require voter registration, those lists exist, at least at the local jurisdictions around the country. So what we have in post-World War II America is the computerization of America. Well, I think we're all familiar with that. What happened in the 60s and the 70s and well into 80s and certainly now, the country got computerized. And voter lists became available like anything else on computer. I happened to arrive in this crazy world, luckily, at about that time. I arrived here in Washington, D.C. to go to GW in 1967 and started my freshman year going to work for my state's United States Senator, Birch Bayh of Indiana, who was actually the author of the 26th Amendment that gave the 18-year-old votes. In trying to become important in that office, what I wanted to do is I wanted to learn about the different services available to Senate offices and how I could make myself important there. And I learned about the computer services available to Senate offices, mostly for frank mail, this ability to communicate in the mail to your constituents and not through the filter of the news media. We had one list available to us at the time, with a list of 13,000 names that was mailed once a year at Christmas time for Christmas cards. And so I made it my mission, which actually took place over the next 13 years in the Bayh office, to build those lists, to acquire them so we could have a more aggressive and a more proactive frank mail program. In 1980, we left the Senate after losing to Dan Quayle, who you may remember. And at that point, we had 2.8 million names on our mailing list with 250 identification codes and had been the biggest mailer in the Senate for 3 years running. Now, a lot of people may say that's a big waste of money. To me, it was a great badge of pride. But the targeting world changed as well. For many, many years, targeting in political campaigns was confined to knowing where the voters were, and eventually organizations like the National Committee for an Effective Congress, NCEC, at least on the Democratic side, put together precinct targeting databases. And what a precinct targeting database gave us was a compilation of election results by precinct. So we could therefore decide what precincts were the best ones for us to campaign in, And therefore, everybody in the precinct would be communicated with. Now, you know, if you're like me and you think about your neighborhood you live in, there are people who look a lot like someone else and not like me in my neighborhood. When I first moved in the neighborhood, which we moved into to make sure there was a good public school for our kids that we hope to have someday, I had neighbors right across the street, 4 old maid sisters in their 80s who'd never been married, were pretty much married to the Catholic Church, and had a very different set of interests than me. Precinct targeting meant we would both get the same piece of mail. And therefore, you're going to at least lose one of us or both of us in a persuasive environment. Other forms of targeting came along. Geodemographic targeting I mentioned here because that was what we used in the Biden campaign in 1980. Even though it was successful, if you remember what 1980 was about, it was successful for most Democrats, 1980. Unsuccessful for most Democrats. Geodemographic targeting meant a company like Claritas, which was based out here in Reston, Virginia, compiled decades of census data to be able to put everyone into a cluster, a lifestyle cluster based on this compilation of information on what they knew about them. And these clusters had nice little handles and names to use for targeting, like pools and patios, shotguns and pickups, things like that. And we used those in our campaign and found that it was very effective. It was, in fact, I'll never forget Labor Day 1980, before we lost, our pollster told us, I have good news and bad news. The good news is our targeting is accurate. The bad news is we're losing the targets. And that was, if you remember, Reagan, Carter, and everything that was going on in 1980 with double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, gas lines, and hostages in Iran. And when you're running in a place like Indiana, it is not the greatest year to be running. So voter files became increasingly important. And they became important in my life because I knew we didn't have them in 1980. And that even though we had this great targeting system, we were using a database of names and addresses, and I didn't know if they were registered to vote. So I knew there was a percentage of the mail and the phones that was going to these people that was totally wasted. Shortly after we lost that election, I was approached by a guy, asked me if I could help his company, got hired by the AFL-CIO to build voter lists that they could match to their members to see who was registered to vote. A fairly elementary use of voter data. But he asked me if I could figure out how to do that and how to find computerized voter lists. And I figured I could as well as anybody else. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know anybody who did know anything about it. So we started doing that. And as we would find these computer lists, and I would keep a yellow pad listing at the time of where is it on computer, how do I get it, what does it cost, what's on it. I would get those, and then we had the ability to let campaigns use them, to try to sell them to campaigns. And I remembered with Birch Bayh walking precincts in Indiana, we would walk to every house in the precinct. You know, that's a waste of time. And there's one thing in a campaign, you have a lot of different kind of resources, but one commodity is always shrinking, the calendar. And anything that wastes time is not good for the campaign. So essentially, I could go to a candidate all of a sudden and say, I can give you a walk list that only includes the Democrats. Something as basic as that. That worked for campaigns. They bought those. Or I could sell you a telephone list and make sure you're only getting on the list the people that you want to talk to. That worked. And a business has been built up over the years. Where it got accelerated into the national campaign effort was when we convinced the Tennessee Democratic Party through the Al Gore for Senator campaign in 1984 to take ownership of that voter file that Gore had us building. The reason for that was through them, they could then make it available to candidates throughout the state. It would be much more cumbersome if it was owned by a federal campaign than if it was owned by a state party. For me as a vendor, that made a lot of sense. I'm able to reach candidates I would never otherwise reach. For the candidates, they had computer data available to them for the first time. And for the state party, they had a role in campaigns they hadn't had prior to that. So it made sense all around. And in the 1984, 1986, 1988 campaign, each year we got more and more Democratic state parties to do this. And eventually the DNC got into the act, the Democratic National Committee, started funding these projects. By 1981, I had started my own company. And when my company merged with Catalist in 2007, which I'll explain in a bit, I was the vendor of 26 Democratic state parties. Catalist was formed in 2006 after the 2004 America Coming Together effort. Now, if you weren't familiar with that, this was a coalition of progressive organizations, AFL-CIO, Planned Parenthood, League of Conservation Voters, organizations like that wanted to coordinate their efforts to have a better chance of having a positive impact on the presidential race. So they worked together to try to coordinate their activities and help John Kerry, eventually the nominee, get elected president, which, as you know, did not happen. When they got back together after that election was over to talk about where do we go from here, the common complaint for everybody was data. Everybody had come on understanding how to use voter lists, but there was no place you could go to get voter data everywhere. And there were, even though the Democratic National Committee at that time was building a national voter file, those organizations that were 501c3 tax-exempt organizations wouldn't use a political party data. So a firm like Catalist to be formed to build this database, to make it available to the progressive community, to sort of serve as a public utility for these progressive organizations, made sense. So we're a very strange company in that we weren't built to make money. We were built to serve this function in the progressive community. And now we've been doing it since 2006. My company merged with Catalist in 2007. The first biggest clients we had when I got there in 2007 were Obama for president and Clinton for president. So we had to learn a lot about firewalls and how you protect privacy and security of lists and everything else, which is important in the list business. But we have now, for several years, been building this national database. So let me sort of give you just the components of what comprises this database, which I can tell you is 280 million voting-age Americans with 700 fields of information. Now, it begins with about 190 million voting records in all states and the District of Columbia, which is matched with previous voter data from previous years, adding census data, census geocodes, national change of address, phone numbers, and households are created. We also have 1.7 billion items of ballots cast, vote history. Did people show up at an election to vote or not? And then we match it to a commercial database that not only adds a lot of commercial data and census data to our data, but also gives us people who don't match, who are 18 and above and don't match the file. So it's now jumped up to nearly 280 million voting-age Americans. And increasingly in that, we get other specialty lists like doctors and nurses and hunters and fishermen, and add those on. And our clients, because it's all online, are able to upload their membership. So we now have 71 million unique individuals who are uploaded as membership from any number of our clients. All this data and modeling and modern modeling techniques have given us the ability to build predictive models that tell us a whole range of things about the likelihoods of a voter to perform a certain way. Increasingly, we're trying to move down the road to be able to be better at predicting who a voter will vote for, what I can kind of consider the holy grail of politics. But we have about 600 models scored by our clients on the database, 711 million contact, response, and other program records, meaning somebody gets a phone call and they say, "Are you for Obama for president?" They say yes. Boom, that goes in the database. That's a voter ID or a response record that cumulatively allows us to build and enhance these models. So that's the database. Increasingly, we want to be able to, as I said earlier, make sure that the more we know about our voters, the better we can communicate with them. This data can be used to determine who you're going to communicate with it, what you're going to say, how you're going to communicate with them. We want to be plugged in increasingly to additional channels so you can access it through texting or Facebook applications or online advertising, television, cable, polling, phones, mail, or walking in person. So that is a quick 10 to 15 minutes, sorry if I talk too fast, thumbnail sketch of the creation of the voter data, the evolution of voter data, and where we are now. Thank you. Should there be questions?
Yeah, if you want to
ask
a question or two of Bob, I'm sure he'd be happy.
I'm happy to if anybody has it. If I don't know them, I'll just tell you. And again, I'm sorry if I talked too fast. There was a lot that I wanted to cover in 15 minutes.
Hey, Adam Sotok with Democracy North Carolina, and been using the van as a 501c3 nonprofit for 5+ years now. I get my question is just,
State Voices, or
yes, State Voices.
so it's our data.
All right, yeah, no, I'm so glad to see a face with the mysterious Catalist data.
This face is not one you're usually happy to see, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so just can you talk a little more about the models, like how you might come up with like a, environmental, friendliness score of 8 out of 10, like how something like that comes together?
Well, sure. I mean, that example would be, two of our clients, for instance, are League of Conservation Voters and the Sierra Club. And so they were, particularly LCV in this case, was very instrumental in creating an environmental model. So if they have, which they do, they have these membership lists. They know people who are members of LCV. And they have lots of people who are not members of LCV who have been called on the phone, and they've ascertained that they either care about the environment or they don't care about the environment. All that data gets matched to ours. So now there's 700 fields of information is appended to these extra records, to these people. And the modeling techniques are such that they can run algorithms to find out what data items kick out to describe the profile of an LCV member, a pro-environmental activist, let's say. And then once you have come up with the algorithm that defines that person, you score the entire database on their likelihood to fit that profile. So everybody in the database is then scored 1 to 100 on their likelihood to be an environmental activist. So when the environmentalists then want to do a campaign and go after people, again, I often say you pick your cherries where the cherries are. We want to help you know where the cherries are, and maybe whether they're ripe or whether they're rotten or whatever, but to know who you want to communicate with and how to communicate. I'll give you a broader example. We created one of the first that I'm aware of partisanship models. I always wrestled with the fact that 20 states don't have party registration in this country. My own state of Indiana does not register by party. People vote in partisan primaries, but they don't register as Democrats or Republicans. So that was always hard to deal with in getting using voter data without having that party ID. Because Catalist has everybody in the country who is registered by political party, everybody in the country who votes in a partisan primary, and millions of IDs that express a party preference or a candidate preference, we were able to build a partisan model that scores everybody in the country on their likelihood to self-identify as a Democrat, including the people who are not registered to vote. So if you're going to do voter registration and you're one of our allies, we want you to go after the people who are likely Democrats. It simply makes sense. But that's a quick summary of how they're built, but they can be very, very esoteric. A number of clients build look-alike models of who looks like their members. We have others, likelihood of going to church at least once a week. We have a Deadwood model. A Deadwood model is we know we can't identify everybody who is dead or everybody who has moved. And on a big database, I guarantee there are dead people on it. In fact, tomorrow I guarantee there are more. So we created a model called Deadwood where we identify people that are probably not there, encouraging you not to spend money trying to contact them. There's no certainties to these. These are all likelihoods. But essentially, it gives you something to use that heretofore did not exist. So I struggled all these decades to make sure you had voter data that existed that had political party, had date of birth, had a telephone number, had race in the southern states. Now we have this universal database with all this data on it and an overlay of artificial intelligence that the predictive models provide. So it's pretty cool stuff. And allows you to campaign more intelligently, and allows you not to waste time and money, not to communicate with people you don't want to communicate with. And I think that this world has moved very fast. I mean, I feel like I've been doing it for an awful long time, and for many years it didn't feel like it was moving fast. But I think, as you all know, with the modern technology as it is, things are changing very, very quickly in this world. In fact, I like to remind people that in 2008, Facebook and YouTube were huge in that campaign, and they did not exist in 2004. And the iPhone, for all intents and purposes, did not exist in 2008. It was invented in 2007. But I bet you there are very few people here who don't have one. So the technology is changing very fast, and the standards have gotten very high. This process is good, it works, and it's kind of where we have come after all these years, and don't ask me where we're going because I really have no idea. All right?
Time has gone fast.
Thank you.
So now, a topic close to my heart. After all, I'm an overseas voter, and perhaps there's some others in the audience. There have really been some tremendous strides made in overseas and military voting, and just in the last 5 years, or less, actually. The MOVE Act, the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, came out in 2009, and soon, we hope, will be the Century Act passing. These are reform acts for UOCAVA, and they've made a huge difference in modernizing overseas and military voting. However, it's not just all about legislative reform. There's really a lot more to do. If voters aren't interested in voting, as you all know, it doesn't really matter what the laws are. Anyway, sometimes you need a breath of fresh air. And this is an area where we have needed it, and it's kind of been surprising that that breath of fresh air came out of the Pentagon, of all places. So we have Matt Boehmer here today of the Federal Voting Assistance Program, and he's that breath of fresh air. Matt's really the face of change at the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or the FVAP for short. He's bringing a new way of working with the agency forward, and I'm very pleased to bring him here for you today. Thank you.
Wow, that's big stuff. Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all of you for being here today. I realize that this has been a long day filled with lots of information, and I'm just pleased that your ears and your eyes are ready to see another 65 slides. So hang in there. We're almost done. Just so you know, I was just teasing about that. Thanks again to Susan and to the Overseas Vote Foundation and to the U.S. Vote Foundation for having me here today. And a particular thanks to the election community and to the advocacy groups for your commitment to our men and women who serve in uniform and protect our country, and to their families and to our overseas citizens. Their challenges of distance, complexities, and mobility deserve our very best, and they deserve my very best. So what's my story? What do I bring to this community? My story starts out as a military brat traveling around the world with my parents, who caught on to this interest of public service, of education, and of research and statistics. And I've spent the last 22 years at the Department of Defense. So yes, the math is correct. I was a kid genius, started at the age of 7. But what I've done for that majority of the time was to ensure that the vitality of the all-volunteer force, by ensuring that our influencers, particularly our parents of youth, knew about the opportunities that were available to their children for military and military service. And as I'm speaking to a group of parents, it's always a great thing when you start mentioning the military and military service and how parents get this uneasiness around the subject. It's a great place in terms of what we think about the military, but when it comes so close to home in terms of my child and my service, there's definitely some doubts and uneasiness that comes into it. So what we did was take a look at through education, through outreach campaigns, and through research, we were able to recognize those doubts and fears that parents have, and we were able to create an education and outreach campaign that recognized those and encouraged parents, like you do with any other decision, to discuss the option of military service with your kids. Make it a conversation, make it a part of everyday life. And we were able to do that in a very productive way that was able to show parents and parents' decision process. And not always that this was a great idea, but at the end of the day, what parents want for their kids is support. And they are there to support their kids. So fast forward to today. What does that all mean? Today, I am now responsible for ensuring that those very same young men and women that I've encouraged to enter the military service, I now have the responsibility to make sure that their right to vote is protected and that they're aware of that right and that they have the tools and resources to do so. And I'm very, very excited to do that. I'm going to be taking my background in education, in outreach, in marketing, and in research, and apply this to this wild, crazy world that you guys call elections. My elections experience actually will come into play here because there isn't much. As like most voters who vote in polls, we worry about elections very infrequently. Every 2 years, particularly during those big every 4-year election cycles, is really when the attention hits. So I'm going to take that experience and take my work with the Department of Defense and apply it here to the elections community. And the elections community have been really eager to embrace, hopefully, some new ideas. And they aren't necessarily revolutionary ideas. They're just some new ways of approaching things. And my vision is to take things like reducing obstacles and hopefully one day eliminating all of these obstacles that our UOCAVA voter faces. I also want to make sure that we can expand that awareness. We know that education works. We know that awareness works. We also know from our 2012 election report and the data that we took a look at that those who touched one of our resources were more likely to return their ballot. So when you start taking a look at how information plays and what impact it can have on elections, it's really huge. So I'm hoping to make an impact there as well. I also want to make sure that we take a look at the metrics that we do and enhance, and enhance the measures of effectiveness. Really be able to come to this community and say, let's put a stake down. Let's do this, and let's do it through research. Where can we go when we start with some facts and figures and move on from there? I just wanted to briefly talk about a couple of the accomplishments of the Fvap staff. As you guys are well aware that the Fvap staff works tirelessly for the elections community, particularly for the military, for their families, and our citizens living overseas. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of accomplishments from them. We, too, have launched a new information website and portal. And much like what Susan talked about earlier, it's not just a fresh repaint where we put some pictures up and changed a couple of colors, but it's really based in research. And what we did was take a look at usability studies and how we can actually put information together and group it very naturally so that users of our website can come to it and very naturally know where they need to go for information. It's been up for about a month, and we've gotten some really great positive feedback. So as you're on fvap.gov, and if you have any sort of questions, have any sort of input, please let us know. Mandy Richmond, my public affairs officer, as well as David Byrne and his tech team, really did a nice job at putting this website together. It should be a huge benefit as we come into the 2014 election cycle to not only our voters, but to election officials, as well as our voting assistance officers as well. I've learned more about mail delivery in the past several months than I ever thought I would. And it's largely due to Vidar May from the Military Postal Service Agency, and she's here with us today. Vidar is a walking encyclopedia of information about military mail. And I strongly encourage anybody who has any questions about MPSA and military mail delivery to please make sure that you talk to Vidar. There's a lot of questions out there. There's a lot of needed information about how MPSA works with the United States Post Office to make sure that military mail works. MPSA has been a real big part of the success of the Department of Defense with our voting initiatives. Particularly if you were able to read our 2012 report to Congress, you will see about the large number of ballots that actually were able to be tracked. You'll see about that large number of ballots that were delivered. So they actually were able to take that undeliverable rate and actually decrease it by a tremendous amount. As well as the average transit time of only being about 5.6 days from the voter to the election official. And those are all huge accomplishments. But as we know, we always can do more. And the department has put together a resource in partnership with the Department of State. Mark Raugus is here from the Department of State, as well as the United States Postal Service, to modernize the military mail delivery system. And this is going to be huge, and it's a big effort. And what we're calling it, it's the Military Postal Address Redirection System. And military PARs will redirect undeliverable addressed mail to military and diplomatic addresses the same manner as civilian mail works. This is a huge accomplishment. So when you think about military mail, what used to happen is that mail would travel from, let's say, a local election official to the post office. The post office runs all the way through, gets to the MPSA facility overseas, where at that point, an address can be corrected and then shipped off to the correct address. Now, with military PARs, this will happen at the very first stage at the local post office. So any sort of change of addresses will happen at that point and will be redirected. So you can imagine how much time local election officials will save, how much time voters will save with this new process. And on behalf of the Department of Defense, I wanted to say congratulations to MPSA, the Department of State, and the United States Postal Service for really, really taking this initiative by storm. I think this is going to be one of those approaches that we can really take a look at and be proud of the work that we're doing in this area. Something that's really familiar to me is education and outreach. This is a slide that I love because it really is about the voter. And what we're doing is not only taking the education that we've provided in the past to our local election officials, to our voting assistance officers, but we're applying this direct to the voter technique. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we know that the more information that our voters have, the more likely they are going to be able to navigate through this process. And it's complicated. When you're talking about a group of military personnel who are from all over the United States put together in a group, the rules for one military member are going to be different from another because they're from different jurisdictions, from different states. So what we want to be able to do is make sure that they understand this process. And we're creating very, very easy to read information that can be passed out. And of course, it all lives on our website, but we're putting them together in digital toolkits that will be available for local election officials, for our voting assistance officers. But more importantly, this information will get directly to the voter. We also don't want to treat our voters all the same. We know that there are voters out there who need very little information to navigate this process. But we also know that the Department of Defense has a large number of young men and women who this could potentially be their first time voting. So why not take this opportunity to make the first time the best time so that it sets them up for future success? So we need to market to these guys differently. And by market, all we mean is give them information differently. Make sure that they're comfortable with the process. Make sure that they understand the process. And not only do we have this opportunity to do this for our young men and women in the military, but we also have U.S. citizens who are in schools overseas, high school, college, that we'll be able to reach too with a message that says, you know, make your first time count. So again, Mandy Richmond and our staff is leading this effort and is just doing a fantastic job of making sure that our voter is ready for the 2014 election. This is kind of the mantra that I've been living under since not only since I've come to Fvap, but really in my previous job as well. And it says a lot. And really what we've seen today is this whole idea of working together. And working together seems to be the key. I always say that we're at our best when we work together, and we do great things when we listen. And you've seen lots of different examples of that today, with the Democracy Fund and the OVF collaboration grant, working on a research approach to remote voting. Thanks to Dana and Dean for sharing all of their work. You can imagine they could have just simply gone back into their own corners and have developed work and not shared. And they've opened themselves up to this whole process, and they've opened themselves up to a community, they've opened themselves up to some potential criticism, and they've taken risks. But they did it in the name of let's do this together, because we know that this is not easy stuff. And I think listening and working together is going to be key. And to that end, I think that you'll see an approach that worked for the Federal Voting Assistance Program is how we updated the FPCA and the Fvap this year. Instead of sitting back and designing a form by ourselves, under the direction of Scott Weidman, what we were able to do is open up this process and make it public. And by making it public, you open yourself up to the ideas and suggestions of a community that all have different interests. So what are we able to do? You're able to put it out there and for comment. And we got lots of comments. We're able to incorporate a lot of it. But what you're able to see is where we weren't able to incorporate your comments, you're able to see why. And it's not a mystery when it comes back. And why is this here and why is this there? Why was not my suggestion taken? We were really able to open this process up. And I think that's a great example of where we want to go. Another example is the Presidential Commission. And I had a brief opportunity to talk to Tammy today about that. And their work has just been critical. And as Susan mentioned earlier, I don't know if the timing of that report is planned, but it really will have an impact on what we do. And it's not about saying that there is everything wrong, but what it's pointing out is we can always do better. And our voters, no matter if they're UOCAVA voters or domestic voters, they deserve better. And we know that we can do better. And as Tammy mentioned, if we can do one thing, two things, three things that they suggest, I think our voters will be in a better place. So I really appreciate the Commission's work and pointing out the things that we can contribute to. And we're doing things just like that, especially in terms of address updates with the military postal address redirection system and the work that we're doing within the department to really remind our servicemen and women that you need to let your local election official know when you move. It's going to be some big communication that we're working this year, and it's really important because if you move like they do so often, but your local election official can't find you, getting your ballot's going to be tough. So with that additional proactive solution and with the work for the Military Postal Service Agency, we think we can make a dent into this. We'll also be working with the Council of State Governments on many of the issues that the Presidential Commission came up with. We're going to discuss issues in terms of form usage by both the voters and states in terms of the FPCA and the Fvap. So very, very timely. And as well as the role that data and data standardization plays. At the end of the day, we're in this together, and I'm really proud to be the new director of Fvap. I'm incredibly proud of the work of the department, and particularly proud of the work of the Fvap staff. It's an honor to lead that team, and it's an honor to be part of this elections community. So on behalf of the Department of Defense and Fvap, thanks again for your attention. I'll be around, be able to answer questions a little bit later on this evening, and I really appreciate all that you do for our men and women in uniform. Thank you.
What a breath of fresh air. We thank Matt and his team. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Seth Lynn, our next speaker from the Center for Second Service. And as I think you know, the Center for Second Service is trying to encourage returned vets to run for public office. And I think the statistics that we've probably all seen is that there's a declining number of members of the Senate and the House, for example, who have military service. I think Senator Metzenbaum was the last survivor of World War II to be a member of the U.S. Congress. So the work that Seth and his team and his organization are doing, I think, deserve the attention and respect and support of all of us. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Seth Lynn to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Just listening to Matt's words in the green room a second ago, and I'm happy to be following him because he really set the tone for what I wanted to talk about. Is my presentation coming up? I hope we haven't gotten death by PowerPoint. We just want to stop it for the rest of the day because I actually have some pretty good visuals I wanted to show you. Is that coming up? All right, well, I'll just start anyway. I'm Seth Lynn. I'm the director of the Center for Second Service, which, as you just heard, is an organization dedicated to getting veterans involved civically. It really began as through politics, just getting veterans involved in politics and running for office, and it's grown since then. It began a while ago. I was still in the Marine Corps at the time, it was about 6 years ago now. And I always heard my boss, who's been in the Marine Corps for 26 years, about to retire, and he always would say, you know, back in the day there used to be a lot more veterans in Congress, and it was so much better back then, and I thought it was one of these stories that you always hear for the old guys about how things were so much better back in the day. But I actually began studying this a couple of years later, and in a second you're going to see this great-looking graph that'll show you how many veterans there were in the end of the Vietnam War, and then how it's been declining steadily since then to nowadays, when we have just around 20%. So that kind of got me started with this idea that I really should do something about this. Oh, there we go. Okay, go to the next slide, please. And do I have a clicker here? I'm sorry. Right here. Okay, great. I'm just gonna. Is that? Yeah, that's the laser. So I'm sorry about this. I should have definitely gotten a better practice there. Okay, there's that graph I was telling you about. And you can see sort of how it's declined since then. So I began this organization as a grad student thinking, I served with a lot of people who would make fantastic elected officials, but have no idea about politics. The trouble was I didn't know anything about politics either. I'd studied political science at the Naval Academy and been in the Marine Corps for 6 years. That didn't really help. Luckily, I could grab some friends around me who were all going to grad school together at Princeton and said, hey, can you help me with this? You worked on campaigns. You were a campaign manager. You ran at some point. And they all wanted to help out, whether or not they had any military service themselves, which was really inspiring for me. And this grew over the time. It's been a real whirlwind for the last few years. But we're now called the Center for Second Service here at the George Washington University. And I'll tell you a little bit about our programs in a bit. But one thing I've also gotten to do as of last semester is be an adjunct professor of legislative affairs and teach a course in civil military relations. And people always say, you learn more from your students than you teach. And I was like, yeah, people say that. But in my case, part because I'm a Marine, but it was definitely true. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things that they were able to study for the last semester that really have a lot to do with what we're talking about and what Matt was really talking about in the last segment. So the first story I just want to tell you about is about 100 years ago, and it'll be hard to believe that this actually happened 100 years ago. To the right there, well, to the left, first of all, is obviously women's suffrage. That happened in 1920. And to the right, you have General Truscott, who was a hero of World War II. He commanded the 15th Army, the 5th Army, and then after the war, he took over the 3rd Army for General Patton. If you remember the Patton movie, he was featured in that. But in 1923, he and his wife, Sarah, were arriving at Camp Marfa, Texas, with the 1st Cavalry Division, and doing a rotation out there. And it's important to consider at the time, this is almost like you could be considered overseas voting today, because this was not just going to a garrison in Texas. This was actually a frontier where they were concerned about Mexican revolutionaries coming into Texas. It had happened. Pancho Villa had done a few raids. And so it was almost like an overseas deployment. But what's interesting is at first, town-gown relations were pretty good, but there were 10,000 people in the town. And like most southern towns at the time, Marfa was 100% Democrats. And it split almost evenly between a conservative and a liberal faction. And the liberal faction would spend more time on post, and the conservative faction apparently tended to not appreciate the bridge playing and the cocktail parties and the dances that they have on post, and so they kind of stayed away. Well, as I mentioned, the 21st Amendment had just been ratified 3 years earlier. So the liberal candidate and his wife together were able to use that to their advantage. And the only proper record of what happened is from General Truscott's memoirs and interviews he did later in life. But what I found fascinating is at the time, Texas law prohibited voting by felons, insane persons, and regular members of the U.S. Army. And can you imagine what would happen in Austin if they tried to pass a law like that now? So it's kind of an amazing how sort of we're sitting here today and think about that was less than 100 years ago. So anyway, Captain Truscott, was a good soldier, followed orders and so forth. And so he spent the morning of the election, or the primary, at the rifle range. And he came back at noon, and his wife Sarah had put together lunch for him. And she said, "Guess what? I voted." And this was apparently, later he talked about how mortified he was. And he said, you what? And she said, "I voted." And she talked about how the liberal candidate had, his wife had come on to post and gathered a bunch of her friends and take them all out to vote in town. And, she was all excited, and she said, "Why don't you give me a cigar?" And he was, of course, hugely mortified that his wife would go out and vote, because this just wasn't done at the time. So when the election was done, when the primary was over, the liberal candidate had won by such a thin margin that it was obvious that the officers' wives had been a determining factor in that election. So a huge uproar ensues at this point. And the losing candidate is appealing to both the state authorities and the commanding general of the division, saying this is not right. And so the general brings in all his officers and berates them for allowing their wives to vote. You can imagine how that would go over today, too. And eventually, they appealed to the state authorities. The state authorities said, well, these officers weren't residents of Marfa, so their wives couldn't legally vote there either, and they ended up overturning the election. So that is something that happened in the state of Texas less than 100 years ago. I found that when 3 of my students actually did a project on this, I found it pretty fascinating that actually happened. As I said, the class I was teaching was in civil military relations and politics. And the question of civil military relations over history has really been about how do you keep Rome safe? How is the military strong enough to keep Rome safe without letting Caesar cross the Rubicon? How do you give your military enough power to adequately defend and be at the same time struggle with balancing between maybe they might turn that around on us? And the founding fathers were hugely concerned with this. If you read the Constitution, you start to think maybe they overdid it a little bit even. And this is an article from The Onion. If you think about all the organizations out there that protect the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, well, you don't really have any to even worry about the Third Amendment. I mean, it's just almost taken for granted that that's not going to ever be a problem. And up until World War II, the way they would generally deal with this potential threat was after a major war, they would just decimate the military. They just make it much, much smaller, and people's ranks would go from being a brigadier general to now you're a captain. And they keep the military very, very small. And that happened up until after World War II when the Cold War happened. I've looked at, as I taught this class, I looked at the sort of veteran involvement in politics, which tracks very closely to military civic engagement, almost identically. And I look at 3 basic waves. The first wave is sort of at the founding of the country. I think of George Washington being sort of the model of that, the ideal, who goes off and defends the country and wins the Revolutionary War and then is willing to just go home and then becomes called to serve again, serves as president, and then after 2 terms says, I'm going to go and give up power, which set the tone for everybody else. But what's interesting about this time, that warfare at the time wasn't as technical as it is today. So you had a lot more folks who were aristocrats, sort of, they come in and they'd lead during a war, then they might go back to something else they were doing. And the same kind of people who would be generals with the kind of people who would be presidential aspirants. In fact, as you see, it goes up sort of up until after the Civil War. But at the beginning of the Civil War, only one West Pointer was a general. It was McClellan, and by the end, it was almost everybody had gone to West Point because it was becomes more of a technical enterprise making war. So funny, McClellan was also the candidate against Lincoln, as we all know. And what's interesting is there was a feeling at the time that perhaps he would be able to garner a lot of the soldiers' votes. Lincoln didn't think so, and he, in fact, made major lobbying efforts to make sure that there were either absentee ballots or furloughs for all the soldiers he had fighting around the Civil War. And especially in some of the swing states, he was very strategic about it, and made sure that the generals in charge would give them either time off or an absentee ballot where state allowed. And studies, actually one of my students did a study about this too, but the research shows that Lincoln won 78% of the soldiers' vote, which was a little surprising given they were running against the former general. But it just kind of showed that this whole idea of Caesar coming across the Rubicon was not really a major threat for the U.S. And I guess the point here is that, as General Washington once said, when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. And a big part of what we're all taught about today and what I do is about you need to make sure, it's obvious we need to keep the military apolitical, but that does not mean you have to be not politically or civically engaged. That's sort of the balance I think that you strike. Anyway, in wave one, I just want to tell another quick story to you about how there is actually a threat here, even if it's not of Caesar coming across the Rubicon, there is a threat of impropriety when the military gets too involved in politics. General Winfield Scott He had an interesting situation where he was fighting for the nomination in 1852 against the president, who was Millard Fillmore, and Secretary of State, who's Henry Clay. Let's pull a little Rubio there. Now, what's interesting is he had actually previously relocated his headquarters from D.C. to New York to get away from President Polk. Then he moved it back when the election was coming up to D.C. He could actually do this back then. And then at the time, electioneering was not, especially primaries, were not what they are today. It was sort of a backroom deal. And so when Clay's and Fillmore's supporters couldn't really agree on who was going to be nominated for the Whigs, they decided to end up in a consensus candidate, which was Winfield Scott. And so he ends up running against Franklin Pierce in the general election. Now, interestingly, they'd actually been fighting together during the Mexican-American War, and Franklin Pierce being a brigadier general under General Winfield Scott. And at the Battle of Contreras, Pierce's horse fell and tripped and sort of ended up on top of Pierce and caused him an excruciating leg injury, which he could barely recover from. The next day, there was another battle, and Winfield Scott himself actually ordered him to the rear. And he protested and said, for God's sake, General, this is the last battle of the war. I need to be there with leading my brigade. And he relented and let him ride his horse into battle. He tied himself down to his saddle, at which point he began running into the battle and didn't fall off his horse, but he did faint from the excruciating pain in his leg. So later on, you see this political cartoon up here. It's basically Winfield Scott riding his gamecock and Franklin Pierce on a goose and saying, oh, I feel faint. They would make fun of Franklin Pierce for having fainted during battle while Winfield Scott was in charge. And it was, you might think of it as an early form of swift boating. But even more improper, the really improper part of this was from a standpoint of keeping the military apolitical. Fillmore, having lost the nomination battle, was still a loyal Whig. And so what he did is he realized that Scott needed to shore up some of his support in a bunch of different states. So he sent Scott on a mission to a bunch of different states to look for soldiers' asylums, what we might now call VA hospitals. Find suitable sites for a soldier's asylum, and they happened to be in a bunch of states where he needed to shore up support, especially among Germans and Irish. And whenever he'd go there, the Whigs would have a reception so they get to meet in glad hand. And it was one of the first times that a presidential candidate had actually gone and solicited votes in person. So after the resounding defeat of Winfield Scott by Pierce, he didn't faint on the campaign trail. He ends up Winfield Scott ends up taking his headquarters again and moving out of D.C. and going back to New York. And so this entire story, again, it's hard to believe that this could have happened in this country. This kind of thing would happen, and you can imagine what would happen today if General Petraeus had decided, I'm just going to move my command to a different place because I'm running for president, and while I'm actually on active duty. You can see how this isn't a situation we really want to have either. And wave two sort of comes in the wake of the Civil War. I mean, it happens afterwards, but it really is sort of the shadow of the Civil War. We have Grant becoming president, and everyone says he's a great general, not such a great president. And William Tecumseh Sherman, who was asked to run, and he said, if drafted, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. And basically took the military and really made it a little bit more of more closed off and less civically engaged for a while. And you see that from 1901 to 1948. You have very few veterans who are nominated for president or were nominated for president, and included 5 consecutive elections without a single vet. And you look at Teddy Roosevelt, and he's almost a throwback to that earlier time when you had more aristocratic people sort of coming in and taking the hill, and then the Rough Riders, then coming back. So a lot of that, even after World War II, this was happening, and a lot of it, I think, was just a kind of an insular mentality in the military. It wasn't as civically engaged as it had been earlier. And it's in that time period that we have the issue with Camp Marfa and the officers' wives. And I read this exactly, but General Truscott later recounted the situation, saying, officers stationed in Marfa during this little political storm learned thoroughly that it was not well for the military to undertake to influence the selection of candidates for political office. So that was sort of the mentality at the time. After World War II, we sort of have a third wave. And I think of General Eisenhower as sort of being the exemplar of that. If you think of Winfield Scott as being too political in the military, and you think of Sherman as being not civically engaged enough. Eisenhower might be a good sort of middle ground there. Sort of transcended politics. Was not beholden to either party and was able to sort of, somewhat the way the military is seen today is being above political maneuvering. And then up until 92, every single major party's nominee had some type of military experience, with only one exception. So the question now, and this is sort of where I wanted to get to after what Matt was talking about, is are we entering a new era? We've just had a first presidential election without a single veteran serving, and I don't necessarily think that we are. I think that we've sort of come down. We've seen these slides, but here's something interesting. So as the decline in vets in Congress has happened, there's also been a corresponding decline in the confidence of Congress. And I don't think that's because, right? So while the military's been going the other way, and I don't think this is because, voters around the country are clamoring for more veterans in office, but I do think that there was something about shared military service, especially in World War II, that transcended partisanship. And there are so few things that still transcend partisanship in this city. And that is, I think, a big part of why there's not the same camaraderie there was across party lines as there was a few years ago when there were a lot more veterans there. And if that doesn't convince you, we all know about democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies are less likely to fight one another. Academic at Duke, Peter Fvap, did a study recently where he ran the numbers and found out that military experience in the elite, that's Congress, presidency, the administration, has a greater effect on ensuring that the country is peaceful than whether other countries are democratic. So that's just another one I'll throw in there. Anyway, so all that together is why I'm doing what I'm doing here, what we're doing at this university. And I'll tell you a little bit about the center for a sec. We, as I mentioned, are about 4 years old and are trying to get veterans more civically engaged. We have what's called a Second Service Fellowship, which is for graduate student veterans who are interested in running for office, working on campaigns, working in legislative affairs, and go to our graduate school of political management. We have a semester in Washington for student veterans who are from around the country. They come for a semester and they learn about politics especially and what available opportunities there are for them in D.C. We really started as this whole thing called the Veterans Campaign Workshops, which were candidate training programs for veterans. Excuse me. And lastly, we have a distinguished speaker series, which you're actually about to see right now when I introduce Peter. Basically, the idea is that we bring in a bunch of folks who have made a transition from the military to politics in some form or other. Generally speaking, they're members of Congress or the Senate, often appointees. Tonight we have the executive director of the American Legion's Washington office. So just to sum up, I think in a lot of ways as we move forward, try to get more veterans civically engaged, and as I said, it really begins with voting. I mean, that's a big part of fulfilling your civic duty. I think of the greatest generation, what made them great, and the things I think about are, they were obviously committed to service. I mean, what they did was, there's no way to overstate that. But they were also civically engaged. Unlike some other previous generations who got, fed up with politics and so forth, they really wanted to stay engaged. But they're also well educated, and that sort of brings me to my next point. There's FDR signing the GI Bill right there, and interestingly, the GI Bill, was a big part of a lot of these titans of politics that served in World War II and then went on to be great senators and so forth had really begun their career with the GI Bill. And the very first GI Bill recipient went to school right here at GW. His name was Don Balfour. And this has been a long-standing, sort of mission of this university. So in just the way that that you and your organization is helping to, get more veterans civically engaged or military civically engaged when they're overseas, which is a big part of it. The educational aspect of it is something that we're working very hard at here at GW. GW Valor is a new program. It's about a little less than a year old. Veterans Accelerate Learning Opportunities and Rewards. And just a few months ago now, almost a year, the university brought in Vice Admiral Mel Williams to run it. He's the Associate Provost for Military and Veterans Affairs. Are you here right now, sir? I can barely see through the, there he is right there. And the idea here is to make the quality learning that we have at this university more affordable and available to veterans and tailor it to what they need. Some of the things that we're doing beyond second service, I mean, it's really growing a lot from here. This is one part of a larger project. But we're expanding learning opportunities in Hampton Roads, Virginia. We're putting a lot more online programs for undergrad and graduates, so that if you're in the military and you're deployed overseas, you have a chance to do to finish up your degree. Maybe you've gotten some classes done. You have a couple choices. I mean, you have sometimes you have some for-profit universities who are constantly sending you stuff to kind of get your tuition money, get your GI Bill money, but you also have an opportunity to get a degree at George Washington University, which obviously will be a much more helpful piece of wall art at the end of your degree. And we're also working on making GW extensions available on military bases. So if you're stationed somewhere in Fort Belvoir or down toward Norfolk, that you have the chance to actually get in-person instruction, and we're bringing instruction to you instead of you having to commute all the way up to D.C., which, as you've probably noticed this morning, can be a real pain. That is the end of my talk. Again, I just want to sum up. My whole point here is to say that it's really important that the military does stay apolitical and nonpartisan, but it does not mean that it can't be politically engaged and civically engaged. And in fact, when you look at history, we've done such great things when our military has been engaged in that way, and I think it does actually help with our ensuring that Caesar does not cross the Rubicon, or that we don't have to worry about the Third Amendment and quartering of soldiers and silly things like that. But it really does bring a lot of fantastic people to this city, where I think they're needed more than ever right now. And on the note of the GI Bill, I want to introduce Peter Gaytan, who is the Executive Director of the American Legion's Washington, D.C. office. The Legion was a huge part of bringing the GI Bill on originally, and the new GI Bill as well. And it's the largest veterans organization. Peter's been the Executive Director there for 5 years, has been with them for 15. He's another political science graduate, he's just told me, who came to D.C. thinking he might know about politics and learned very quickly that he didn't, but has learned so much over time, and now he's running the legislative efforts for the largest veterans organization in the country. And a cool fun fact, I'm just going to keep plugging my students here, but another one of my students did a study of where the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans were, what organizations they were joining. And the Legion doesn't really publish this a lot, but they have close to 250,000 of their 2.4 million members are Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. So it's a huge group that's doing a lot of good for a lot of folks. And I just want to welcome Peter Gaytan.
Well, thanks, Seth, and thank all of you for that warm welcome. I want to just add on to some of the things that Seth had mentioned, not only about the American Legion, but about the Center for Second Service and how amazing that idea is that Seth had, and how productive they are at helping those veterans who understand what it means to commit to service, to continue that service. Those veterans who've been touched by their experience in uniform and how they want to continue to serve their community and our nation. The American Legion is proud to support Veterans Campaign, and we appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with Seth and his staff on the Center's mission to assist those veterans who are seeking to continue their service to our great nation through public service as civilians. Seth's vision to create the Veterans Campaign is very commendable. It's important that veterans who feel compelled to continue to serve are provided the assistance they need to successfully integrate the political structure. The Legion commends you, Seth, and your efforts to assist the best and brightest of America's veterans. Also, I want to express the Legion's support for the mission of the Overseas Vote Foundation and the U.S. Vote Foundation. The Legion has a proud history of advocacy in ensuring that our election process is fair and just, especially for our service members. It's important that all men and women in uniform are afforded the opportunity to cast their ballots and be accounted for, even if they are stationed overseas or on deployment far from home. It's been a pleasure meeting and speaking with the fellows at the Center earlier tonight, and for those of you whom I have yet to meet, I am Peter Gaytan. I'm the Executive Director of the American Legion National Headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Prior to beginning my career as a military and veterans advocate here in D.C., I was active duty Air Force at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. During my time at Dover as a young enlisted troop, I was privileged to serve on the Honor Guard and to augment the staff at the port mortuary there. Dover is home to the military's largest port mortuary, and any military or family member who dies overseas comes through Dover Air Force Base and is processed through the mortuary before taking that final journey home. It was there as a 23-year-old senior airman that I personally truly learned the meaning of service. I helped to bring home the remains of 18 Army Rangers killed in Somalia during the Battle of Mogadishu, or as we all know now, Black Hawk Down. Draping the U.S. flag over the transfer cases of our fallen heroes and ensuring that their remains are safely transported home for final honors definitely instills an appreciation for not only your own mortality, but the value of being part of something bigger than yourself. The military experience can galvanize a person's commitment to service, and I'm just lucky that I've been able to continue that service as the executive director of the America's largest veteran service organization, the American Legion. I'm now on the front lines in the battle to secure and protect the earned benefits of our nation's veterans. And I'm lucky enough to have the strength of an organization that will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2019. And I'm lucky enough to have the strength of 2.4 million members of the greatest veteran service organization in the world when fighting to protect retiree compensation, or reduce the VA disability claims backlog, or urge better communication between DoD and VA to ensure effective claims processing. We also urge better communication between DoD and VA to ensure effective identification, diagnosis, and treatment of TBI and PTSD. Through the American Legion, I'm able to continue to serve, and I'm truly grateful. The American Legion has a certain image that most Americans have. You think of the American Legion, you may think of the funny cap and old guys waving flags, or that local post down the street that may have a bar, maybe smoky. And the struggle that we have, and I guess I shouldn't characterize it as a struggle. That image of the American Legion is not something to push away or to fear. That image of the American Legion is the foundation of our organization. And the battle that we fight now is to remain relevant. But we can remain relevant by standing on that foundation of that organization that is defined by those old guys in funny hats, because those old guys in funny hats given us the opportunity to do the things that we've done here. The battles they fought did create the GI Bill, the original Service Members Readjustment Act of 1944. Seth mentioned that, and that has been called the greatest single piece of legislation in American history. The GI Bill that the American Legion fought to pass created middle-class America. It gave returning service members the opportunity to raise a family, to purchase a home, to start a business, to become employed. That created the infrastructure of our great nation today. And that's due to the sacrifices that they gave while wearing the uniform overseas to protect us. But we as a nation back then recognized the need to ensure that when they returned, they were taken care of. That when they returned, we didn't turn their backs on them, that we understood the sacrifices that they've been through. And we understood as a nation that we owed them. That we owe them for the sacrifices they've made and the security they've given us and our families so we can raise our children. The American Legion is strong in this nation, for this nation, not just for veterans issues or for military issues, but for our nation as a whole. Aside from the GI Bill, the issues we now face are to welcome back the newest generation of veterans. And we're doing that every day by fighting to ensure that Congress doesn't cut the cost of living increases for military retirees. If you're unaware, Congress right now is looking at the entire federal budget and saying we need to cut some costs. So they're targeting the smallest percentage of Americans, those military retirees who have earned this benefit. They haven't asked for a handout. They've earned this through their service to this country. 20 years or more, they've worn the uniform to protect us. But our Congress is saying, let's take away their increases in their retirement pay to help reduce the budget. That's ridiculous, and the American Legion won't stand for it. We're fighting those battles. We're continuing to fight those battles every day. We want to ensure that this new era of veterans coming back, who are suffering from the signature wounds of this war and from Iraq with PTSD and TBI, that DoD and VA are able to collaborate to ensure that that transition is smooth, that VA can communicate with DoD. It can ensure that we have accurate diagnosis and treatment for PTSD and TBI. So the organization that is often associated with smoky bar rooms and old war stories and flags waving and funny hats, and I have my hat here, I just chose not to wear it this evening. But I did that on purpose. I didn't want to give you an image of an organization that you already have a preconceived notion of. And when I say that, again, it's not that we need to ignore the history of this great organization or the men and women who built that foundation and built the GI Bill and provided for our nation and go to those spaghetti dinners and go to those fundraisers. We're going to stand on that foundation. We're going to reach towards the future. We're going to say, what can we continue to do as a service organization for veterans that will carry this nation into the future? So we're not neglecting our veterans and those men and women who serve. Like Seth said, we have smaller numbers of members of Congress who even understand what it's like to wear the uniform. We as a nation, our society may not be as affected directly by military members. We might not have an uncle, a son, a cousin, a sister, a daughter who's serving in the military. But I tell you what, it's our obligation as every citizen in this nation to understand the sacrifices that they paid. And it's our obligation as citizens and as a nation to make sure that we don't forget that. In the American Legion, and I take seriously my role as executive director of the American Legion here in Washington, D.C., to not only carry forth the messages that are defined by the 2.4 million members that comprise our great organization, but it's important that we continue to carry that message. And we're doing that every day. And I do want to thank Seth again for even reaching out to the American Legion, getting through that image, and giving us an opportunity to move forward. And I explained earlier when we had our session with the fellows earlier that I have seen within the organization of the American Legion a real awakening. Those Vietnam veterans who struggled to get the power away from the World War II veterans within the service organizations realized that they don't want to cause that same struggle for the newest generation of veterans. The Vietnam veterans are ready to assist this new era of veterans. It gives them a sense of accomplishment. For them to say, what happened to us, we won't allow to happen to you. And they've opened the door within our organization to allow the newer generation to address the needs. They say, we're here for you, but you guys lead us. Stand on the foundation of this organization. Show us where we need to go next. And opportunities like this and collaborating with great organizations like Student Veterans of America, with the Center for Second Service, this is how we become relevant in the future without neglecting our past and ignoring what brought us to where we are today. So it's exciting to be here and part of this evening, and I thank you, Seth. And I'm also proud of the staff of our organization who are part of the Center for Second Service. We have staff who are here and are studying to do more because they understand that commitment to service. They remember what it was like to wear the uniform and be part of something that's bigger than themselves. And they've taken that uniform off, but they've continued that commitment to service. And that goes back to what Seth was talking about. I really like that graph. Confidence going up, reality going down, but the veterans are still there, and we will be there. And Seth, you and your fellows clearly understand the importance of being part of something bigger than yourselves. The fact that you each are challenging yourselves to not only pursue higher education, but focus on an outcome that will provide an opportunity for you to continue to serve in the highest levels of government illustrates your undying commitment to service. For each of you to commit yourselves to a new mission, a mission that carries on the tradition of service that you came to value during your time in uniform, will benefit the nation as a whole. And honestly, for you to pursue a future in politics in today's environment here in Washington is extremely admirable. I personally admire each of you for what you're doing and what you aspire to achieve. And with Seth's forward thinking and admirable vision in the creation of the Veterans Campaign and the Center for Second Service, it's inevitable that our nation will benefit from your continued service. Today, more than ever, our nation needs individuals like America's veterans, like Seth, like the fellows, like my staff, like the men and women that you see waving those flags and wearing those funny hats. I think there's a time for our nation to return back to those core values that we seem to neglect. When entertainers at the Grammys reach the front page and the fact that Congress is cutting retiree benefits is nowhere to be seen, reflects poorly on our nation. We need more individuals who understand that meaning of sacrifice, who understand what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves, like I've said. We need more heroes, like each of you, who feel strongly enough to seek out opportunities that will allow you to continue your strong commitment to service. And I pledge to you that the American Legion stands ready to join in ensuring that we all work together to cultivate this new era of veterans and not forget the tradition, those men and women, our uncles, our grandfathers, our neighbors. The guy in front of you at the grocery store is taking too long and you're frustrated about it. Well, he may have liberated a concentration camp, and we owe him the respect that he deserves. So I commit to you that the American Legion will still be here, we'll still be doing good things for our country, and together we can work to show this new era of veterans the thanks of a grateful nation, the true thanks of a grateful nation, and that is not to forget their sacrifices and to ensure that we provide a voice strong enough to show that what they've sacrificed for us will not be forgotten, because we will ensure that Congress will not cut the benefits that they've earned through their service to this country. So thank you very much, and thank you, Seth, again, for including the American Legion.
Well, we're getting towards the end, but I now have what I think is the best job of Summit. Each year, OVF awards certificates of merit for meritorious service to those people who have helped overseas citizens and military to be able to vote and have those votes counted. We really don't want anybody to say, I didn't really care or worry about voting because I knew it wouldn't count. And we're going to recognize today 3 people who have made considerable contributions to making that happen. These are people who are behind the scenes. They're not necessarily people that you have seen in some of the roles that might have seen before. I want to kind of set the tone for that by quoting Ambassador Dwight Murrow, who was a partner of J.P. Morgan prior to the Second World War and was named the ambassador to Mexico. And he had a son graduating from college in, I think, 1938, if I remember. And he felt compelled to write some words to his son that would help guide his life going forward. And he said something along the following lines: "My son, as you go into your life, you're going to find that the world is divided into 2 kinds of people. Those who try to take credit for what's happened, and those who actually make it happen. My advice to you, my son, is to be in that second category. There's far less competition." Today we're recognizing 3 people who fit into that category. The first recipient of our award for meritorious service is Scott Weidman from the Fvap. Scott, if you come forward, I'll just say a few more words, and then we'll give you a chance to respond. Scott has completed more than 20 years service at Fvap. He's done an awful lot of jobs, and we've seen him in many different roles. He served under 4 directors, starting with Polly Brunelli, and the current director we had the pleasure of hearing now. Personally, I see Scott as kind of the face of Fvap, because since I've been involved in this, Scott's been a constant, and I applaud you for what you've been able to do. I have only one small concern about presenting this to you, and that is I'm told that you don't get rid of anything, and I'm afraid it's going to get lost in your office. But let that go, and we'll certainly be happy to give you the opportunity to do this. I think it's noteworthy how much you've done with military, with the voting assistance officers, with the State Department, with civic organizations like OVF, and all of the other people, election officials that you worked with. So we commend you for this, and we thank you for your service to Uocala voters.
Great, thank you so much. If you want to say anything, just go ahead.
It's just it's always been an honor and a privilege to serve those that serve us, and I can't say it any better than the last couple of presenters have done. But it's a great honor to be here, and this is my 8th summit with OVF as well. So it's been a pleasure to be at all the summits and enjoyed all the candor and the discussion that's gone on, and really move forward the discussion and a lot of progress to help the military and overseas voters. So thank you so much. Thank you again. No, that's fine. That's fine. The next recipient of an award is, well, internally, I've decided that these awards should be called the Susans. You know, we have the world of Oscars and Emmys and Cleos. We refer to these as the Susans, even if she doesn't choose to acknowledge it. Well, the next recipient of a Susan is to recognize one of our own, our Chief Financial Officer and a Director, Richard Vogt. If Richard would come forward, we'd really like to be able to honor him. Let me say a few words. Yeah. I just want to say a few words and make Richard embarrassed before we go along with this. Richard was first associated with OVF when, as a trailing spouse, he moved to Bavaria because his wife worked for BMW, which had a plant in South Carolina, which is where, not Richard's from Massachusetts, but he was living in South Carolina. Pardon? No, south. Yeah, south. He became a UOCAVA voter. He was financially literate, and he became, at first, our external auditor, but quickly we realized that there was so much more that he could do for us that he became our CFO and a member of the board of directors. Richard went beyond the call of duty because his wife was transferred again, and transferred to China. So Richard was always the odd man out when we were having phone calls, because he was getting up at some ungodly hour that the rest of us would not have done so, but he was so loyal and so helpful to us that we really want to recognize you for all of the contributions that you've made to OVF, and we look forward to many more years of collaboration with you. So, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Denise, no.
Let me just finish. I want to not tell who the other one is.
I have a hard time not telling stories about Richard.
Oh, no, you may. You may. We have a third nominee who can't be with us tonight because of schedule, but it is the OVF Pro Bono Counsel who adopted OVF in 2005. His name is Barry Hart, and his firm is Winston & Strawn, where some of you may have visited OVF functions in the Winston & Strawn office on K Street. Barry certainly is one of those people who took Dwight Murrow's advice to his son, because Barry's the kind of person that makes things happen. Barry's firm has been so good to us. They taught us, well, first they helped us get a 501c3 status. And then they kind of took Susan and me and some others under their wing and taught us how Washington works, or whatever, how it kind of works. They even helped us chase an earmark. That was quite an episode in our history. And finally, they've helped us with so many things like the licensing agreement for the software that we share with a number of states and counties and other organizations. So we will present Barry with his award tomorrow at Winston, because the second half of the E2E is going to be at Winston tomorrow, and we will be able to give Barry his award at that point in time. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to recognize at least two of our behind-the-scenes warriors. Thank you.
I could hardly resist getting up here and telling some stories about Richard, but I realized it's getting late, and those stories probably are better told with a drink in your hand, and that's waiting for you. So I'd like to first thank all of you for being here today. You braved the cold. There were so many incredible, fluid, dynamic changes. I hope you didn't even realize that we adjusted the agenda a bit, but thank you for hanging in there with us with some of that. It's been a great day. Every summit is wonderful, and we learn so much. We can carry this forward into our next hour at the reception. All you have to do is go out this door on this side, take a left, and it's one door down. Well, you'll see us all there. Very long building. You can't miss it. I can't remember exactly the address, but don't cross any streets, okay? And don't cross any afterward either. So thank you again, all of you. Hope to see you here next year.